The arrival and the mockery. The sky burned red as the alien fleet arrived. Giant warships hovered over Earth's cities, blocking out the sun. Their metallic bodies hummed with power, casting long shadows over terrified humans below. The invasion had begun. Queen Syra stood tall inside her command ship, watching Earth through a massive glass window. Her violet eyes glowed with amusement as she observed the chaos below. She was the supreme ruler of the Xerix Dominion, the most feared empire in the galaxy. Conquering planets was nothing new to her. She had destroyed countless civilizations before this one. And now, she would crush Earth. Xyra turned to her general, Commander Vexus, who stood beside her. His armored body was covered in glowing energy patterns, a sign of his elite rank. "They are weak," she said, her voice dripping with arrogance. "Look at them. Running. Screaming. Pathetic." Vexus nodded. "Their defenses fell in minutes, my queen. Their primitive technology is useless against us." Syra smirked. "I expected more. Humans were rumored to be fighters." She chuckled. "What a joke." Below, the streets were filled with panic. Cars crashed into each other. People screamed, running in all directions. Giant Xerix war droids marched through the city, their metal feet crushing everything in their path. Tall buildings shook as alien cannons fired, reducing them to rubble. Earth's military forces fought back, but their weapons barely scratched the Xerix armor. Fighter jets soared through the air, launching missiles at the alien warships, but the Xerix shields absorbed the impact like it was nothing. In less than an hour, Earth's major cities had fallen. The human government sent out desperate messages, trying to negotiate. But Sarah didn't care. She had seen this happen before. Every species begged when they realized they were losing. But she never spared them. A holographic screen appeared before her, displaying a human leader, an old man with tired eyes. His face was covered in sweat, his voice trembling. "We surrender," he said. "Earth belongs to you now." Syra grinned. "Finally, a species that knows its place." She raised a hand. "Cease fire. The war is over." The alien weapons stopped. The humans stared in shock. Could it really be over so fast? Syra turned to Vexus. "Prepare the troops. We will take full control by morning." Vexus hesitated. "My queen, this was too easy." Syra raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Vexus glanced at the holographic map of Earth. No real resistance, no hidden traps. They surrendered too fast. Syra laughed. "Of course they did. They are cowards." But deep down, something felt off. The silence before the storm. The night passed quietly. Too quietly. Syra walked through the ruined streets of New York City, her elite guards following behind. Humans watched from behind broken windows, their faces filled with fear. The Xerix soldiers patrolled the streets, scanning for any remaining threats. There were none. The human military had completely vanished. Syra frowned. This was not normal. In every other invasion, there was always some resistance. Even the weakest species fought back. But here, nothing. She grabbed a human by the collar, lifting him off the ground. He was a young man, shaking in terror. "You," she said, staring into his eyes. "Where are your warriors?" The man stammered. "We surrendered." Syra narrowed her eyes. "I know that, but humans love war, don't they? Where are your secret weapons? Your hidden armies?" The man gulped. "There's nothing left." She dropped him. He scrambled away, disappearing into the shadows. Something was wrong. Vexus approached her. "My queen, our patrols are reporting strange disappearances." Syra turned to him. "What kind of disappearances?" "Scouts. Missing. No bodies. No signs of struggle." Syra's fingers tightened around her staff. "This planet has secrets," she murmured. For the first time, a seed of doubt crept into her mind. She had mocked humanity. She had called them weak. But now, as the night grew darker and the silence deepened, she had a terrifying thought. Had she underestimated them? The first trap. Queen Syra stood in the ruined streets of New York, the cold wind whispering through the crumbling buildings. The city was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Her soldiers marched through the ruins, scanning every shadow with their glowing eyes. The Zyrics' dominion had conquered thousands of planets, but never had a world fallen this easily. No resistance, no hidden armies, just silence. Zyra had mocked the humans for surrendering too quickly. But now, as she walked through their ghostly cities, an uneasy feeling crept into her mind. Something was wrong. Her second-in-command, Commander Vexus, approached. His armor, dark and polished, reflected the dim glow of the alien war machines parked in the distance. His expression was unreadable, but his voice carried concern. "My queen, another patrol has gone missing." Zyra turned to him, narrowing her glowing violet eyes. "Missing?" "Yes. No signs of battle. No distress signals. They simply vanished." Zyra clenched her jaw. She had fought countless wars, crushed civilizations, and faced enemies who resisted until their last breath. But this was different. She looked around at the ruined city. Where were the bodies? When the Zyrics invaded a planet, there were always bodies, civilians, soldiers, the fallen remnants of war. But here, it was as if the humans had simply disappeared. The thought sent a strange chill through her. "Order all remaining patrols to move in larger units," she commanded. "We are not alone in this city." The disappearing soldiers. Hours passed. The alien forces moved carefully, their weapons ready. Every street, every alley, every shattered building was searched. Still, no signs of life. Then, at the edge of a destroyed shopping mall, a high-pitched scream echoed through the empty streets. Zyra and her guards turned toward the sound. "Report," she barked into her communicator. Static. Her violet eyes narrowed. "Vexus, send a squad to investigate." The commander nodded and signaled a group of Zyrics hunters, elite warriors with razor-sharp senses. Their heavy boots crushed the debris beneath them as they advanced into the darkness. Minutes passed. Then, another scream. This time, it was closer. Then silence. Zyra's hands curled into fists. Something was hunting her soldiers. She activated her wrist device, scanning the area. The system detected no threats. No heat signatures. No life forms. Nothing. Yet her soldiers were vanishing into thin air. "This doesn't make sense," Vexus muttered. "There's nothing here, but we are losing troops." Zyra's jaw tightened. "We are not dealing with cowards. We are dealing with something else." She turned to her guards. "Prepare for an ambush." The guards raised their weapons, scanning the shadows. The tension in the air was thick. Then the lights flickered. And in that moment, the world around them changed. The first attack. A sudden explosion ripped through the sky, sending metal shards flying. A Zyrics hovercraft overhead plunged to the ground, crashing into a building. The city came alive. Figures emerged from the darkness, moving unnaturally fast. Not soldiers, not civilians, something else. Zyra barely had time to react before the first of her warriors dropped to the ground, blood pouring from an invisible wound. Then another. And another. The Zyrics warriors were powerful, their bodies enhanced by centuries of war. Yet they were falling too quickly, as if something knew exactly where to strike. Zyra raised her weapon, scanning the area. Her enhanced vision caught glimpses of movement, but no clear enemy. How were they doing this? A whisper filled her communicator. "You should have left." Zyra froze. A human voice. Distorted. Cold. Then, in front of her, a body fell from the sky, landing with a sickening crack. One of her own soldiers. His armor was shattered from the inside. His face was frozen in an expression of pure terror. Zyra's heart pounded in her chest. For the first time in her long reign, she felt something foreign, something she had never truly experienced. Fear. The hidden war begins. Thyra had underestimated the humans. She had called them weak. But this was not weakness. This was a trap, a new kind of warfare, a war of shadows, deception, and fear. Fall back, she ordered. Regroup at the command center. Her soldiers moved swiftly, forming a protective barrier around her as they retreated. But the attacks didn't stop. Every few steps, another soldier fell. Their blood painted the streets, and yet, no enemy could be seen. Zyra's heart pounded as the whispers returned, this time louder. You thought we were prey, but you invaded the wrong species. Zyra gritted her teeth. This was impossible. How were they doing this? Then she saw it, a symbol painted on a ruined wall, glowing faintly in the dark. Not human, not alien, something older, something terrifying. Zyra's breath hitched. She recognized the pattern. It was a warning not meant for humans, but for invaders. For the first time, she realized, humanity was never weak. They were just waiting. The psychological warfare begins. Queen Zyra sat in the war chamber aboard her command ship, her violet eyes burning with rage. The alien fortress hovered above New York, its dark, metallic hull reflecting the broken city below. The invasion had begun with laughter, her laughter. But now, the laughter was gone. Her forces had suffered unexplained losses. Entire patrols had vanished. Soldiers had been found dead with no wounds, their expressions twisted in horror. Some had turned on each other in blind panic, attacking their own comrades, as if something had infected their minds. This was not war. This was something else. Her second-in-command, Commander Vexus, stood before her, his armor scratched and battle-worn. Even he, the most feared warrior of the Zyric's dominion, looked shaken. "My queen," he began, his voice unusually quiet. "We are losing control." Zyra slammed her fist against the cold metal table. "Ridiculous. We outnumber them. Our weapons are superior. The humans should have been broken by now. But they are not fighting like any species we have faced before," Vexus replied. His dark eyes flickered with unease. "They are using something else against us." Thyra's gaze hardened. "Explain." Vexus hesitated. He was not one to fear battle. But this was something he could not explain. "Our soldiers are seeing things," he admitted, "hearing voices, experiencing visions of things that are not there." He took a breath. "They are turning on each other, fighting shadows. Some have even taken their own lives." Zyra stared at him. That was impossible. The Zyrics were a warrior race. They were bred to be immune to fear, to mental weakness. "Humans had no psychic abilities," she said firmly. "No advanced mind weapons. This is trickery." Vexus shook his head. "Then how do you explain this?" He pressed a button on the table. A holographic projection appeared. Security footage from one of their outposts, a small alien base set up inside an abandoned human police station. The recording showed Zyric soldiers standing guard, their red eyes scanning the empty streets. Then, without warning, one of them suddenly dropped his weapon and started screaming. Zyra watched as the soldier clawed at his own armor, as if something unseen was crawling under his skin. The others backed away, shouting orders, until one by one, they also collapsed. The footage ended. No enemies, no shots fired, nothing. And yet, the entire patrol was gone. Zyra's fingers curled. This was not natural. "How did they do this?" she demanded. Vexus exhaled. "We don't know. The War of Shadows." Zyra descended back to the city, her personal guards following closely. She refused to sit and watch from above. If there was an enemy, she would face it herself. The streets were deserted. No humans, no resistance, only the eerie, suffocating silence. Her eyes flicked across the ruined cityscape. searching. Her advanced helmet scanned for heat signatures, for hidden life forms. Nothing. Yet, she could feel something watching her. She turned a corner and stopped cold. On the broken walls of a collapsed building, symbols were painted in blood. Strange, ancient markings, some human, some alien. The words, scratched into stone, sent an unfamiliar chill through her body. It read, "You GT the war to US. Now, you will learn." Then, a sound, a whisper, low, distorted, speaking a language she could not understand. Her soldiers froze. Their weapons were drawn, scanning the area. But Syra knew the enemy was not here physically. They were in their minds. One of her guards twitched. Then, without warning, he turned and fired his weapon into another soldier's skull. Syra barely moved as the body fell at her feet. The attacker, breathing heavily, blinked in confusion. His red eyes widened in horror as he dropped his gun. I didn't. He looked at his hands, trembling. He was. Then he screamed. A scream so raw and filled with terror that even Syra, the ruthless queen, felt something foreign in her heart. Fear. The soldier collapsed, his body convulsing, until he went still. Syra stepped forward, kneeling beside him. His eyes were open, but he was dead. No wounds, no impact, just fear. She turned to Vexus, who stood rigid, his hand gripping his sword so tight his claws were cutting into his own palm. "We have to fall back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Syra exhaled slowly. No, retreating was for the weak. But this was something she could not fight. And that was when she heard it. A voice. Deep, calm, human. It spoke directly into her mind. "Your army will fall. Your empire will break. And do you know why?" Syra's blood ran cold. "Who are you?" she whispered. The voice chuckled softly. "You came to fight warriors," it said, "but you invaded the only species that thrives in war." Syra's breath caught. The shadows around her moved. And then, everything went black. The queen faces fear for the first time. For the first time in her long, ruthless reign, Queen Syra felt powerless. She had fought wars across the galaxy. She had crushed civilizations beneath the boots of her armies. She had watched entire planets burn under her command. But never had she felt this. A cold, creeping fear slithered into her mind, clawing at the edges of her thoughts. The voice had spoken to her, a human voice. Yet it had not come from any device. It had spoken directly into her mind. Syra stood still, her body rigid, her elite guards surrounding her, weapons raised. The streetlights above flickered erratically, casting strange, jagged shadows across the ruined city. She should have heard the hum of her warships overhead, the distant chatter of her soldiers, the mechanical growl of Zurich's war droids patrolling the ruins. But instead, she heard nothing. The world had gone silent. The once vibrant city was now a tomb, wrapped in unnatural stillness. Syra's enhanced vision flicked through multiple scanning modes: heat, motion, energy readings. Nothing. Her scanners detected no life forms. Yet she knew something was there. Watching. Waiting. The vanishing army. "Vexus, report," she commanded, her voice sharp as a blade. Her second in command was breathing heavily, his hands twitching at his weapon. He was shaken. A warrior who had never once faltered in battle now stood like a man who had seen a ghost. "My queen," Vexus said, his voice lower than usual. "Our forces are disappearing." Syra narrowed her eyes. "Disappearing how?" Vexus swallowed. "Our patrols are reporting hallucinations, soldiers hearing voices, seeing things that aren't there. Some are turning on each other." He paused. "And some just vanish." Syra clenched her fists. "What do you mean, vanish?" He hesitated, then took a deep breath. We lost 2 entire battalions last night. No distress signals. No signs of battle. Their weapons, armor, and even their ships are still there. But the soldiers are gone. Zyra's breath came slow and controlled. And the surveillance recordings. Vexus stiffened. That's the thing, my queen. We checked the footage. One moment, the soldiers were patrolling. The next, they were just gone. No sound, no movement. One frame they exist, the next, they don't. Zyra felt something unfamiliar stir inside her. Doubt. This was impossible. This was beyond any technology or tactic she had ever encountered. But the evidence was right in front of her. Thousands of Zurich's warriors vanished without a trace. She exhaled slowly, regaining control. This was war. And war had rules. Even the strangest battles had patterns. If this was an enemy tactic, then there had to be a weakness. The hunt for answers. Fall back to command base, Zyra ordered. I will find out what these humans are doing. Vexus hesitated. My queen, perhaps we should. She shot him a glare. We are the Zurich's dominion. We do not retreat. Vexus lowered his head. As you command. Zyra turned, her long cloak flowing behind her as she strode toward the transport. The remaining troops followed, their weapons scanning the darkness. The wind howled through the ruined streets. Whispers followed them. Zyra heard it again. That voice. Calm. Mocking. You should not have come here. She spun around, weapon drawn. Nothing. Her soldiers shifted uneasily. They had heard it too. The whisper had no direction, no source. It was everywhere. A cold shiver ran down Zyra's spine. She refused to acknowledge the feeling gnawing at her mind. But deep inside, she knew. The battlefield was no longer hers. The scream in the void. Back at the alien command center, Zyra stood in front of a massive holographic display. The Earth was mapped out in glowing red lights, showing every Zurich's troop location. But she only focused on one number. Troops deployed, 500,000. Troops remaining, 312,000. Nearly 200,000 of her warriors were gone. Not dead, not wounded. Gone. Her mind raced. This wasn't war. This was something else. Something unnatural. Then, a scream ripped through the base. Not a normal scream. This was a scream of pure, raw terror. The kind of sound that made even the strongest warriors freeze. Zyra and Vexus rushed down the corridor, flanked by armed guards. The hall was long and metallic, lined with blinking control panels. As they reached the end, they found the source of the scream. A Zurich soldier, curled in the corner, his armor scratched and his helmet removed. His eyes were wide, unfocused, filled with horror. His breathing was ragged. His claws dug into the floor. His body shook violently. Zyra stepped closer. Soldier, she commanded. What happened? He didn't answer. He just stared past her, as if seeing something no one else could. Vexus knelt beside him. He's in shock. Zyra narrowed her eyes. What did he see? Vexus touched his communicator, accessing the soldier's helmet recordings. A holographic projection flickered to life. The footage showed the soldier on patrol, the dark streets, the eerie silence. Then, shadows moved. Not people, not creatures, shadows themselves. The soldier raised his weapon, his breathing heavy. His scanner showed no life signs. Then, something spoke from the darkness. You do not belong here. Then the screen glitched. Distorted images flashed. Unrecognizable, chaotic. The soldier screamed. The screen went black. The recording ended. Vexus exhaled sharply. What are we fighting? Zyra said nothing for a long moment. Then she turned toward the open window, staring down at the ruined earth. The humans were not fighting them. They were breaking them. And for the first time in her life, Queen Syra felt something she had never allowed herself to feel. Doubt. The Xyrix dominion had conquered hundreds of planets. But now, Syra was starting to wonder. Had they just invaded the only species that could not be conquered? The fall of the invaders. Queen Syra stood in the command chamber of her warship, staring at the holographic map of Earth. Red markers blinked out one by one, each representing a fallen battalion, a vanished squadron, a crumbled stronghold. She clenched her jaw. This was impossible. The Xyrix dominion had conquered entire star systems. They had crushed civilizations more advanced than these primitive creatures. Yet here she was, losing. Vexus stood beside her, his face tense with silent frustration. He did not need to speak. The numbers said it all. 500,000 Xyrix warriors deployed, 289,000 remaining. Another 23,000 lost in just the past 6 hours. No gunfire, no airstrikes, no visible resistance. And yet, they were falling. Zyra turned to the head scientist, a pale-skinned Xyrix researcher with glowing red eyes. "Explain." The scientist hesitated. "My queen, we have studied every possible cause. There is no biological warfare, no advanced technology, no logical explanation." Zyra's fingers curled into fists. "Then what is happening?" The scientist exhaled slowly. "We believe the humans are using fear." Zyra's glare was sharp enough to cut steel. "Fear is not a weapon." The scientist's eyes flickered nervously. "Not a physical one, no. But my queen, the human mind is unlike anything we have encountered. They do not rely on strength alone. They adapt. They evolve. They do not need superior technology because they use their environment as a weapon." Zyra turned sharply. "Are you telling me they are using psychological warfare?" The scientist nodded. "Yes, but not in the way we expected." Vexus, his voice low, added, "They are breaking our soldiers from the inside." Zyra remained silent for a long moment. Then she watched the map again. More red markers disappeared. More of her army vanished. She had underestimated them. She had mocked them. And now she was beginning to understand why that was a mistake. The final defense. The Xyrix forces regrouped at their largest command center, a heavily fortified base set up inside a human city stadium. This was their last stronghold. Thousands of alien soldiers surrounded the perimeter. War droids patrolled the halls, scanning for threats. Airborne Xyrix drones hovered above, their eyes glowing as they tracked every movement in the shadows. And yet, the enemy remained unseen. Zyra stood on the upper balcony, watching her remaining army. "We hold this position," she commanded. "No more patrols. No more wandering into their traps. If the humans want to fight, let them come to us." Vexus, standing beside her, did not respond immediately. "My queen," he finally said. "They already have." Zyra turned sharply. "What?" Then she saw it. A Xyrix soldier stood in the middle of the field below, completely still. At first, she thought he was standing guard. Then she realized his body was swaying. A low, distorted sound crackled from his helmet. Then, without warning, he turned his weapon on his own men. Vam! The gunfire was deafening as the soldier opened fire on his comrades. Screams filled the air. The other Xyrix warriors shouted, confused, returning fire, only to realize more of their own troops were doing the same. Zyra's heart pounded. This wasn't an ambush. This was possession. The human weapon. Fear itself. Ira raced down to the field as chaos erupted around her. Her soldiers weren't fighting the humans. They were fighting each other. The whispers came again. That terrible human voice echoing through the air, yet coming from nowhere. "You don't understand, do you?" Zyra spun around, weapon raised. "Are you?" she roared. The voice chuckled softly. "You thought we would fight you with weapons. A soldier beside her suddenly collapsed, his breath hitching as if his lungs had turned to ice. He gasped, eyes wide, clutching his helmet as blood dripped from his nose. "You thought you could break us." Another soldier dropped, then another. The entire battlefield was falling into madness. "But we are the ones who break things." Syra's breathing turned shallow. This wasn't war. This was extermination. The final challenge. Then the humans made contact. A holographic transmission flickered to life in front of her, showing the human man. His face was partially obscured in shadows, but his calm expression sent a cold shiver down Syra's spine. She did not know this human. Yet something about him felt dangerous. He smiled slightly. "You invaded the only species that thrives in war." Syra gritted her teeth. "What are you?" The man leaned forward slightly. "Your last mistake." Then the screen went black. At that moment, the perimeter alarms blared. The humans had arrived, but not in the way she expected. They weren't attacking with an army. They were sending one man. Just one. Syra frowned. "What is this?" A message appeared on her screen. Simple, clear. "Come fight one of us. No weapons, no armies, just you and me." Syra's blood boiled. This was mockery. A final insult from a species that should have already been destroyed. She turned to Vexus. "Prepare a landing zone." Vexus hesitated. "My queen, this is reckless. If the humans have a final trick." She silenced him with a glare. "I will end this war myself." The queen was the apex predator. The battlefield was silent. Not the silence of peace, but the unnatural hush of something watching, waiting. Queen Syra stood on the ruined ground of Earth, surrounded by her elite guards. Her violet eyes scanned the desolate cityscape. Smoke still rose from crumbling buildings. The air was thick with the scent of burnt metal and blood. This planet should have already been hers. Yet here she was, standing in a war she no longer understood. A single human stood across from her, his body relaxed, his face unreadable. He was unarmed, wearing nothing but a reinforced combat suit. His expression was calm, almost amused. Syra's fingers tightened around the hilt of her blade. "Where is your army?" she demanded. The man chuckled. "You already fought them." Syra narrowed her eyes. "You are alone. You think you can stand against me?" The human tilted his head. "No." He smiled slightly. "I know I can." His confidence sent a slow, unfamiliar chill through her. The apex predator's stare. Syra had fought countless battles. She had crushed species far more advanced than these creatures. And yet, as she stared into the human's eyes, she saw something she had never seen before. He was not afraid. Most species, when facing her, had some level of fear. Even the strongest warriors. They all had limits. But this human, there was nothing in his eyes but calm understanding. As if he had already won. Syra clenched her jaw. This was psychological warfare. A trick. "You are stalling," she hissed. The man smiled again. "No, I'm observing." "Observing what?" The man took a slow step forward. "You. The fight begins." Syra moved first. With inhuman speed, she lunged forward, her energy blade slicing through the air. The weapon could cut through steel, through flesh, through anything. But it did not touch the human. He wasn't there. In the time it took for her blade to descend, he had already shifted to the side, moving with a smoothness that didn't seem possible, as if he knew exactly where she would strike. Syra barely had time to process before. Crack! A fist slammed into her ribs. The impact was like nothing she had felt before. Her armor absorbed most of it, but the shockwave rattled her bones. She stumbled back, momentarily stunned. No one had ever hit her like that before. Her eyes widened. The human had waited, not dodging randomly, not reacting out of fear. He had predicted her move, and he had countered perfectly. Adaptation in real time. Tyra growled, shaking off the pain. She rushed forward again, this time attacking with a rapid sequence of movements, feints, high-speed strikes, calculated attacks. But he adapted. Faster than any warrior she had ever seen. She attacked low. He dodged and countered high. She switched to speed. He slowed down, forcing her rhythm off. She used strength. He redirected her force, making her own power work against her. It was impossible. The Zyric's Dominion had trained for every type of combat, studied every species they had conquered. But this was something else. Every time she adjusted, the human adjusted faster. Every time she thought she had a strategy, he had already figured it out. He wasn't just fighting her. He was learning her, and she was falling behind. A realization too late. Ahura refused to believe this. She was stronger, faster, more advanced. She had conquered entire worlds. Yet here she was, breathing heavily, sweating, feeling her muscles burn. The human, by contrast, stood completely relaxed. No sign of exhaustion, no sign of struggle. "You're starting to understand, aren't you?" he said, voice steady. Zyra tightened her grip on her blade. "Shut up." He took another step forward. She tensed. "You thought we were just another species to conquer," he continued. "But you didn't realize what makes us different." Zyra lunged, but it was already too late. The human moved first. His foot snapped forward, faster than her mind could process, right into her gut. Bam! Her body lifted off the ground. The air rushed out of her lungs. Pain exploded across her ribs. She crashed to the ground, gasping. Why humanity dominates? Zyra lay on the ground, stunned. The human crouched beside her, studying her like a scientist observing a failed experiment. "You invaded a planet full of survivors," he said quietly. "A planet where war isn't just something we do. It's something that built us." Zyra's vision blurred. She struggled to push herself up. "You thought war was about technology," the human continued. "You thought it was about strength." Zyra gritted her teeth, forcing herself back to her feet. "But you never realized the truth," the human said. She lunged again. This time, the human did not dodge. He caught her wrist, effortlessly. And then, in a movement so simple it was almost insulting, he flipped her over his shoulder and slammed her into the ground. Cracky! Zyra gasped in pain. She couldn't move. The human towered over her. And then, he said the words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Humans don't fight for survival. We fight for dominance." The fall of the queen. For the first time in her life, Queen Tyra lost. She lay in the ruins of the city she had thought would be hers, defeated not by armies, not by superior weapons, but by one man, one human. And as she looked into his calm, unwavering eyes, she finally understood why the Zyrics had lost this war before it even began. Because humans don't just fight. They become war itself. The lesson humanity taught the queen. The cold ground pressed against Queen Zyra's back. The pain in her ribs, her arms, her pride. Everything burned. She had never known defeat. Until now. Above her, the human warrior stood, calm, composed, unshaken. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, held something far more terrifying than hatred. Understanding. Tyra had fought thousands of warriors. She had led the Zyric's Dominion across the stars, conquering planets with her superior technology, strategy, and discipline. But nothing had prepared her for this. This was not war. This was a lesson. And she was the student. The final words of a conqueror. Zyra struggled to push herself up. Every movement was agony. She was battered, broken, humiliated, but she refused to show weakness. She met the human's gaze, her violet eyes burning. "Kill me," she spat. The human tilted his head slightly. And then he smiled. Not a cruel smile, not a victorious one. A knowing smile. "I could," he said simply, "but I won't." Zyra's breath caught in her throat. The human leaned down, staring into her eyes as if reading her very soul. "Because you don't understand," he said. Zyra gritted her teeth. "Understand what?" The human straightened, taking a slow step back. "You invaded the only species that refuses to lose." Zyra's hands clenched into fists. "You think you've won," she hissed. "You think sparing me makes you superior." The human gave a small, amused exhale. "No," he said, "I think sending you back makes us superior." Zyra's blood froze. A message to the galaxy. Her soldiers, what was left of them, stood in the wreckage, weapons lowered, their faces twisted in confusion. The once mighty Zyrix war fleet hung in the sky, battered, directionless. Her empire was watching. Her people were waiting. And now, she had lost. The humans had not just defeated her. They had chosen to let her live, to let her carry the message. The galaxy would not hear tales of a mighty queen leading her forces to victory. They would hear of the only battle she had lost. And worse, they would know why. The humans wanted her to spread fear. And for the first time in her life, she realized they didn't need to conquer the Zyrix. They had already broken them. The final retreat. A sharp beeping noise echoed from Zyra's communicator. Her flagship was hailing her. She hesitated. She could still fight, could command her remaining forces to strike, could order a final desperate retaliation. But then she looked around. The ruins of her soldiers, the haunted, shattered expressions of the survivors, and the human warrior, not moving, not watching in fear, just waiting, because he already knew what she was about to do. Zyra exhaled slowly. Then, with trembling hands, she tapped her communicator. "All forces," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "fall back." The Zyrix fleet turned, and for the first time in history, the Dominion retreated. A war that never ends. As Zyra's warship rose into the sky, she looked down at the planet she had failed to conquer. Earth. A world that had once seemed small, weak. Now it felt different. Not because of their weapons, not because of their tactics, because of what they were. She turned to Vexus, who sat beside her, his face still pale from what they had witnessed. He didn't speak for a long time. Then, finally, in a voice that barely carried over the hum of the warship, he said, "My queen, what are they?" Zyra's fingers tightened around the armrest. "They are the one species we should have never challenged." The silence that followed was heavier than any defeat, because deep down she knew the humans had not won a war today. They had proven they were something worse, a force that could never be truly defeated. And the Zyrix Dominion would never forget. The warning. The Zyrix homeworld stood silent as Queen Zyra stepped onto the palace balcony. Below, millions of her people gathered, waiting. Her advisors, generals, commanders, all of them stared. They were waiting for her to speak, to explain how the unstoppable Zyrix had been stopped. Zyra looked over them, her jaw tight. Her chest burned with shame. She had never admitted defeat before, but this was different. She exhaled. Then, in a voice that carried across the entire planet, she gave the order that would change their empire forever. No Zyrix shall set foot on Earth again. Murmurs spread through the crowd, confused, disbelieving. Zyra's eyes darkened. She had mocked humanity. And in return, humanity had done what no other species could. They had mocked her back. The lesson was clear. Earth was no ordinary world, and humans were no ordinary species. The end, for now.